Welcome to a sure to be fantastic presentation by Dr. Andrew Steer of the World Resources Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Steer. My name is Rebecca Moore. I lead the Google Earth team, which also includes Google Earth Engine, Google Earth Outreach, and we're affectionately known internally as Earthlings. My team has worked with Andrew's team for a number of years. I'll say a little bit more about that later. World Resources Institute, it doesn't brag about it in your bio, but they are considered to be, by many accounts, the most authoritative, credible environmental research organization in the world. They're extremely effective, and they work at the intersection of science, research, policy, economic development. They have incredible impact on the ground from global to local. They create instruments and indices and measurements that are the standard by which countries all over the world measure themselves. They are really the organization that is taking a close guardianship look over our natural resources in a very authoritative way. They have 450 experts that work with leaders to address 6 urgent global challenges with a focus on forests, food, water, climate, energy, and cities. Dr. Steer joined WRI from the World Bank, where he was Special Envoy for Climate Change. He's also currently co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Natural Capital. If you don't know what natural capital is, you should Google it. It's a term you should all understand. He was educated at St. Andrews University, Cambridge University, University of Pennsylvania, with a PhD in economics. And again, I wanted to just step back. My Google Earth team, in particular, Google Earth Engine and Google Earth Outreach, has been working with Andrew's team for several years on the development of a couple of really transformative technology platforms. The main one is called Global Forest Watch, which is the world's first high-resolution, near real-time global forest monitoring system. It's powered by Google Earth Engine. We worked together from the very early days of whiteboarding a design on a Google whiteboard with his team. And it launched in 2014 and now is having fantastic impacts that I hope that you will speak a little bit about. It's been a great partnership because what Google has to offer, of course, is massive computational resources, massive data, fantastic ability to process algorithms on this data. But we're not the scientists, we're not the policy people, we don't know the levers of change for environmental protection, and WRI does. So it's been a fantastic, fantastic partnership with you. Global Forest Watch. Now they're working on Global Resources Watch, which will also be powered to some degree by Google Earth Engine. And we're really excited that you exist and are doing the great work that you do to protect, preserve, and educate us all about the planet. So he's going to speak today about stories to watch in 2016. And please give a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Steer.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Rebecca, very much indeed. It is just the most wonderful partnership that we have with the Earthlings. Thank you, and friends like David over there and Salim. I mean, it really is a joy to work with you guys. You are making the world a much, much better place, and we are deeply privileged to work with you. What we do once a year, at the beginning of the year at the World Resource Institute, we get our experts together and we say, what should we be watching in the coming year? We come up with sort of 5 or 6 what we call stories to watch. And this is actually the 14th year we've done it. And then at the end of the year, we look back and say, did those stories turn out the way that we hoped they would? And so what I was going to do today, quite quickly, I'm going to go through quite a lot of slides quite quickly, is lay out 5 stories for 2016. We believe that this is a very, very important year. One of the reasons is the picture on here, of course, it's Paris, and there was the historic climate deal, which I suspect some of you, I know some of you, were at. in December, and we think that's going to be a game changer. So let me plunge right in, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards, and you may have your own stories or you may disagree with these stories, but I hope it at least stimulates some thought. Look, this is a difficult world we live in right now. The past year has been extraordinarily difficult. More refugees in the last year than any year since World War II. For us as Americans, hard to really realize how important it is. But in Europe, it's been a game changer. So too, terrorism spiked last year in a very, very dangerous way. It is a dangerous world we live in. And the economy is also in pretty bad shape. As we enter 2016, it's the worst economic start to any year for several decades. And all of the projections of the world economy are gloomy. So it's sort of a rather dismal time, or is it? Remarkable signs of hope. In the last year, I was privileged to be in this room. It's the General Assembly of the United Nations last September when the Pope spoke. And after the Pope, Shakira sang. And you notice she's actually dressed quite similarly to the Pope. And you'll notice also here everyone is sitting, but when Shakira started to sing, they all stood up, you see. And after Shakira sang, the entire world, represented by 196 countries, approved unanimously the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to talk about them in a minute. These are goals to 2030, and a very, very important thing. And then just 3 months later, we had this in Paris. Basically, a historic agreement on climate. And so what 2016 is all about is moving, if you like, from commitments and agreements to real action on the ground, getting the plumbing right, doing the investment. And so the stories I'm going to talk about are mainly related to that. How are we now going to get on with it and deliver? And obviously the first story is about, will the momentum that countries committed to in Paris, will it continue? Now, what actually happened in Paris, and some of you know this, some won't. I mean, never before have we had 187 countries saying we are going to be part of the solution to climate change. So too, never before have we had a long-term goal of decarbonization of the world economy. Every 5 years, countries are to come back and raise their level of ambition. Every country has to agree to common transparency about how they measure their emissions. We've got good agreements on adaptation, and we've got some financial support. So this is really important. This is where we were heading in terms of temperature. Because of the commitments in Paris, this is where we're heading now. It's still 4.8 to 6.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where Paris agreed we needed to be. So whilst this is a huge achievement, what countries have committed, it is not enough, and we need to continually ramp up the ambition. So on the 22nd of April, all the countries in the world will meet again to officially sign the declaration at Paris. And we'll learn a lot then as to whether or not the level of passion and commitment that existed in Paris will continue. And it's important that it does, because business community is not yet sure whether it's real. This is what we did at the World Economic Forum last month. They asked 1,000 opinion makers, CEOs of major corporations, and the question was, of 50 risks, which is the one that worries you the most? And along here, it is the likelihood of the risk happening. Up here is the impact if it does happen. The number one risk up here for business people of all is not, whether interest rates will fall or rise or there'll be a recession. It is there'll be a failure on climate change. This is the business community saying this matters to us. So these are the countries that are committed to actually address carbon emissions. The blue ones are committed to actually reduce tons of carbon. The green ones, they are committed to reduce carbon as a share of their national income. And so we will know throughout this year whether there is a seriousness about implementing that. And we also need to look at some specific countries who have made specific sectoral commitments. So India, for example, is a hugely important country. As you know, they have committed under their new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, to invest in 100 gigawatts of solar. Today it's 3 gigawatts of solar. The predecessor government said by 2022 we're going to do 20 gigawatts. And Prime Minister Modi said, no, by 2022 we're going to do 100 gigawatts. So we will know this year whether there's a seriousness about that. So that's story number one. It is, will there be momentum from countries? Story number two is similar to that, but it doesn't apply to countries, it applies to corporations, and it applies to city mayors. Because in Paris, it wasn't only the countries that committed, it was really amazing commitments from corporations and from cities. And so we see this this was just one meeting that I had the privilege to be at and speak at, which had about 70 CEOs from companies. At Paris, more than 1,000 companies committed to put a price on carbon, for example. 150 US companies committed to support aggressive climate action. 120 companies committed to what are called science-based targets. In other words, we won't only do better, we will do enough based on the science. What we'll be looking for this year is whether there are more companies that actually are going to say, here's what our target is to be part of the solution. These are ones that have already announced precisely what they will be doing in terms of greenhouse gases, and they're going to monitor that year by year and be accountable to that. So too, Google has been, as you know, perhaps the leader in the world on renewable energy, and we have some of our friends here that are leading that work, both on your purchasing side, but also on your investing side. And Google has really led the pack in many ways on what's called RE100, a commitment to be 100% reliant on renewable energy. And of course, Google not only is 100% going to rely on that for the energy you need, you are also generating gigawatts. You will be. You're already generating 2 gigawatts for your own needs, but you're going to be generating gigawatts rather. They're astonishing commitments. One of the things we're looking at in this coming year for the private sector is all of these companies that made these commitments and gave fabulous speeches. Will their trade associations and will their lobbying efforts be consistent with that? We recently did a study and we saw that 60% of major companies say the right things, but of that, only 1/4 of that number actually align their lobbying towards that end. And one of the great things about Google is you're very consistent. And we would love to see an even greater profile of you lobbying to actually get the government into the right place. And so this is a very important story to watch because trade associations generally lag their members in wanting change. So Chamber of Commerce and others are still, quite frankly, rather old-fashioned in their views on some of these important issues on sustainability. That was the private sector, but equally important, mayors. Something like 500 mayors went to Paris. This is Mayor Bloomberg, who sort of led the charge. It's the Paris City Hall. And 425 committed to what's called the Compact of Mayors. And what they said is, we will be transparent about, and we will measure and be transparent about our greenhouse gases, and we will have goals that are more ambitious than our nations. And what we're going to do this coming year is really to monitor this. We're helping many of these cities measure, and we're going to see, is this seriousness and this enthusiasm, is it continued? And one of the important things that will happen this year will happen in October. Every 20 years, they have a big conference called Habitat. And this one is the first for 20 years. And the question will be, is the new way of doing cities going to be the theme of this? Because it turns out that whether or not we win or lose the battle against climate change will depend upon how we design our cities. At the moment, cities can be the problem or cities can be the solution. Two cities with the same population can have one can have 10 times the carbon emissions of another. And what we're learning now is if you actually design cities around people rather than around automobiles, you can have a more efficient as well as a more sustainable city. So that's the second story for 2016. The third story is this, which relates directly to all of you. I told you that there were the Sustainable Development Goals. This was New York City when they were announced. These are very, very important. I mean, this is the entire world agreeing on the goals it will have for 2030. And this is how they're organized. So there's goals on poverty, on ending hunger, health, education, etc. And down here, the decent work, clean energy, climate, oceans, forests, inequality. So you see all of these. And there are 17 goals, and there are 169 targets. So a target, for example, could be to double the rate of renewable energy, say. And there's going to be 200 proposed indicators. The story for 2016 is, are they going to really use modern techniques to measure progress? And that gets into the kind of thing that we do with Google. So, for example, how will they choose to measure? The old-fashioned way of measuring is to get some UN agency to spend a long time collecting data, publish a thick report, and gradually it reaches governments, and slowly it might affect decisions. But nowadays, we have 1,261 satellites up there, every day beaming back unbelievable information. There are people in this room that know more about how to turn these billions of data points into information in a user-friendly way sitting on the desk of a Minister of Finance in Jakarta than anyone else on the planet. And it will be transformative if we get this right. So, for example, agricultural productivity. We can do 1,000 different soil samples and all that. Or we can also use remote sensing, which can actually predict harvests. Consider GDP even. This is work that you guys do. You can actually predict sales by lots of simple little tricks and algorithms. This is counting cars in a car park in a shopping mall. Doing that right, learning, continually revising the algorithms and the relationship, you can get real data in the hands of real decision makers much, much quicker in a very transformative way. We can even measure poverty differently. I think you guys are also involved in this. Poverty measurement is exceedingly difficult if it has to be done by household surveys. We still should do that, but then there are tricks of actually using proxies. For example, using remote sensing. I'd love to go into that. What kind of roof, how many have changed the roof, all kinds of things like that. This is what we were talking, Rebecca mentioned Global Forest Watch. Again, transformative. In the old days, I remember talking to President Yudhoyono of Indonesia. He said, I don't know if my forest policies in Kalimantan are being honored because I get something like a year and a half late. And so I don't know. He says, now I've got something that tells me what happened last week. And it tells me exactly where it happened, so that I know exactly who to blame and who to send where to solve it. This is a very, very remarkable thing. We'd love to talk to you about it much more, because without you, this would not exist. It's a really wonderful thing, and we are seeing all around the world. Every single country in the world has now used this for serious policy decisions, except for North Korea. So if anybody has links in North Korea, we would love to make it complete. So that's land use change. And so too, we're using the same technique now for actually assessing carbon emissions from deforestation. This we launched at Paris, again with you, where due to a lot of advances in the way we understand emissions of carbon from deforestation, we're able to do that. And there are just so many applications of this that I would love to talk about. So too on water. Collecting data on water is exceedingly difficult. We now have some fairly sophisticated modeling capabilities across 15,000 of the main aquifers, watersheds in the world. And now for the first time ever, we are using remote sensing to actually look at water quality, which we've never managed to do before. So this is a very, very important issue for 2016 as the world begins to implement its sustainable development goals. And together with Google, I think we're partners together in this idea of Resource Watch, is basically say, okay, what we did for Global Forest Watch is fine. We're now going to put lots of different overlays, so they will be very, very easy to actually do all kinds of comparisons and look at relationships. This is going to be a very big project for us, which we're planning to launch this year, and we are really thrilled to be doing it together with you. Let me just give you one example of the kind of thing that will be on this. We can project a water risk using 12 different indicators. using projections from the IPCC, which is the scientific body that tells us what will happen on climate change. And then we overlay, for example, all these black things. This is the color is how intense the water risk is and whether or not it's going to be changing, getting worse. The black marks are actually coal plants to generate electricity. Why are these two relevant together? You need an awful lot of water in order to generate electricity from coal, for example. So if you are an Indian minister responsible for energy security, this is extremely helpful and actually very worrying information. That's an example of how putting different layers on top of each other actually make a huge difference. If you do the same, by the way, of this on irrigated water, you see a really astonishing, worrying situation for food security, because you see that the average irrigated hectare in South Asia may today need to feed 28 people. It will need to feed 42 people at a time when water risk and water scarcity will increase very substantially. So you start getting the idea of just how this could be. So what will this mean for the implementation of these goals? We believe it will be transformative. And actually, Google is very central in a way that I'm sure some of you have thought about, but I bet many of you haven't, central actually to the Sustainable Development Goals and the extent to which decision makers all around the world, whether they're prime ministers and presidents, or whether they are CEOs of companies, or whether they are village leaders, can really affect. So that was story number 3, the transformative role of big data. And I didn't talk about artificial intelligence. I'd love to, because that is the coming thing which will radically change the ability of policymakers to make decisions quickly and effectively and get real-time feedback from them. Story number 4 is quite different, and you may wonder why it's such a big story. I mean, food waste. I mean, is it that important? And the answer is yes, it really is. 1/3 of all food in the world is wasted. That is, you produce it, and it never actually enters anybody's mouth. It's incredibly expensive. $1 trillion almost a year is wasted as a result of that. At a time when we're going to need to increase food intake by 70% by 2050, which will require agricultural productivity growth to be greater than it's been for the last 40 years, at a time when we don't have a whole lot more forests to cut down and expand agriculture. So you get the point. So too, think about this. Food loss and waste is equivalent to planting every single acre in the United States, including where there are buildings and roads, with food, tending it, fertilizing it, watering it for a whole year, and then letting half of it rot and then burn the other half. That's what food loss and waste are. The entire United States, continental United States. I mean, you imagine what this is doing to natural habitats, because we're having to take a lot more land for agriculture than we need. And finally, it's a dreadful emitter of greenhouse gases. If food loss and waste were a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter in the world, just after the United States. So you start getting the idea of why this is important. This is very, very important indeed. And that's why one of the Sustainable Development Targets is to halve food loss and waste by 2030. This was the United Nations, same meeting. This is where it was agreed to do that. And the big question is, will that happen? First thing we need is a global standard on how you measure food loss and waste, which we are privileged to be designing. The Consumer Goods Forum has now adopted that. These are 400 members. They have agreed not only to adopt that common standard, but to cut their own food loss and waste by half by 2025. The United States, within 1 week of the global target being set, announced that we would here cut food loss and waste by half. It's going to be very, very difficult. This is Tom Vilsack speaking. He's the Secretary of Agriculture. Gina McCarthy on the right, she's head of EPA, basically making that announcement. And so too, what we've done is realize that actually it will be impossible at a time when food loss and waste is currently rising to reduce it by half unless there is a political and a psychological switch that goes on. So we've created something called Champions 12.3, because this target is called target 12.3 in the UN. This is a guy who's head of Nestle, who's one of the champions. We put together 30 champions that will take it upon them, and they're all CEOs of corporations or ministers from developing countries and from rich countries. It's headed by the CEO of Tesco, which is the second biggest retailer in the world, and the one that is really out front, together with Walmart, on trying to address this. Food loss and waste is almost exactly the same in the developing world as a share as it is in the rich world, but for very different reasons. In the developing world is food loss. In other words, it's difficult to store the food, or rats eat it, and so on, or it gets mildewy. In the rich countries, it's waste. In other words, we don't consume everything that is there. And so we're working on this. This is going to be a big emerging story in 2016. Okay, heading into the home straight now. So that was story number 4. There's just 2 more left. So hope we'll have plenty time for discussion. Story number 5, China really has to be a story. China is going through an extraordinary sort of transition. For the last 25 years, this has been China. China has increased its real income 10 times in 25 years. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, no country in the history of the world, especially a big one, has come close to doing that. I mean, it's been spectacular. So no wonder they're looking so happy. But actually, it's not going so well right now, as you know. There are issues of economic management, a huge sort of volatility in their stock market, the perceptions of whether or not the slowdown will be a hard landing. And this is happening. This is now reaching an extent that is extremely severe. Last November, for the first time ever, they declared what they call a red alert. They closed down schools in many northern cities. They closed down factories because it was simply too dangerous. Now, nobody needs to tell the Chinese authorities that this is a problem. They know it full well, and that's why President Xi, on downwards, continually says, look, we've got to do things differently. We simply can't rely on the quantity of growth anymore. We need to think this through. And China is the first country in the world that, recognizing it's got very serious environmental problems, is saying we actually can't just stop that at the margin. We've got to change the way we run our economy. And so in March this year, next month, China will approve its next 5-year plan. And the question is, just how bold will it be? We know quite a bit already about it. But one of the things, for example, we'll be looking at is, will China continue to be the world leader in renewable energy? China already, this last year, invested $101 billion, which is, in the United States, we invested $40 billion here, and Europe invested $45 billion. So China is twice the level already, and we think they're going to become even more ambitious because they believe in this very, very strongly. So too, watch for what they're doing on coal. This may not seem interesting to you, but in terms of the world and sustainability, China's coal is unbelievably important. And the question is, when will it peak? And the last 2 years, it's actually been falling a little bit. So that's very encouraging. So they're actually using less coal today than they used 2.5 years ago. And it may well be that it's now on a downward pattern. They've already declared a number of cities not to be banned for coal. And the question is whether they'll put more caps on it, and whether they'll instruct their banking system to stop lending so much money for coal. So too, as you may know, just as we in this country decided not to have a cap and trade system, do you remember? The Congress was not ready for it. China is implementing one, as announced, that by next year we'll have a nationwide cap and trade system on carbon, and it's doing some pilots now in 7 cities and provinces. This year we will learn a lot about that. And finally, in China, in many ways the most important thing of all will be, how will they change the way they manage their cities? Chinese cities have been growing very rapidly, just like they are in India, and they will in Africa. And the way they expand is by selling land further and further out into the suburbs. And as a result of that, people can take 2 or 3 hours to get to work, and they lose 10% of their city income just due to congestion, and another 10% due to pollution. And so that's a terrible drag on the economy. It's a drag on society as well. And now China is saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Let's see if we can do it differently. Let's design cities around people rather than around automobiles. And let's see if we can learn from some modern city thinking. And so the building stock in China will triple by 2030. So there's lots of opportunities. In the case of India, it will quadruple. So there's still time to get it right, but there's a real danger of serious lock-in. So that's the story for China. Will it rebalance its economy? And in 2016, we will learn a lot about China. And the stakes are very high. The final story has to be about the United States. Will the United States continue to be a leader on climate change? And some very good things have happened recently, as you know. Very surprisingly, the Congress approved continued investment tax credits for solar. And by the way, some of the policies that are putting in place at the state level, Google has been a great advocate of green tariffs and so on. This is actually a very, very important development. So too, the United States has, the federal level has put a stay, a pause on coal from state-owned land, the Bureau of Land Management. This is a very important thing. 40% of all the coal in this country is dug up on federal land. And a lot of people would say, wait a minute, does that make sense when we're trying to move towards a healthier future? And of course, the Clean Power Plan was finalized last year, which is a very, very dramatic policy introduced by President Obama. And that enabled the United States to announce some very ambitious goals with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, 26 to 28%. But 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, since there are so many suits against the EPA coming from states, nobody needs to do anything until we decide on this. So this decision was the very last one that Justice Scalia made. And on this particular issue, he was on the wrong side, by the way. He was not a friend necessarily to President Obama's environmental policy. So this is rather sort of up in the air right now, quite frankly. 27 states are suing the federal government at the moment over this issue. And why does the Clean Power Plant rule matter? It matters because for the first time ever, power plants are going to have to measure their greenhouse gas emissions and limit it. And that means really sort of a very grim future for coal. So 27 states. Now, before the Supreme Court made its decision, 38 of those states were actually still preparing for this rule, which would be have pretty important implications. Now, a number of those now are saying, wait a minute, we don't need to, so they're backing off. And some states, though, including your own, are saying, not at all, we are going to press on with this. And several in New York State and several others are saying, we believe this is good for our citizens. So there's a lot to play for on this, by the way, and it's a very, very important issue. Related to this, and I say this because I know there are some of you from the energy business here and others might not be so interested, how US utilities respond is actually a very, very interesting issue this year. We're working on this issue with a number of utilities and a number of purchasers, and obviously Google is one of the most important ones of all, signed up to a project that we call the Clean Buyers Club. And so the question is, will utilities come into the 21st century? Electricity utilities have traditionally been very, very conservative institutions, and they are going to have to change. And the question is, are we going to see progress, even although we've had this delay in the Clean Power Plant rule? In June, the Court of Appeals is set to hear the cases, but it won't be decided at the Supreme Court for at least a year after that. So this is a delay that's important. It's not the end of the world, but it is nonetheless quite important. And related to this is how the world responds to this. If you read, for example, the New York Times, delay of the Clean Power Plan stokes worry about the Paris Climate Treaty. There's a blow to emissions efforts may imperil the Paris Climate Accord. We are talking to a lot of developing countries now saying, relax, it's not so bad, don't worry, you were right to trust the United States. This is just a sort of a delay, but nonetheless, this is something we have to monitor because the entire Paris climate deal depends precisely upon trust and mutuality. And so it's very important that we're able to show that, that others should continue to be ambitious because the United States will, in time, be able to be ambitious as well. What to watch for also this year is, will President Obama in the remaining months, will he continue to do things that he believes are right, even although many in the opposition party don't think so. And so there are a number of executive actions, we spend a lot of time analyzing these, that could be made, that could actually improve the situation quite a bit, and we list some of them there. And finally, this year, watch out for what these guys talk about with regard to sustainability and climate change. These two talk about it a lot. These ones don't talk about it so much. In fact, it's not entirely their fault. 5 days after the Paris climate deal was signed, there was a Republican debate hosted by CNN, and not a single question about climate change. And that's really not good enough, we think. We think that these guys ought to be addressing it. And so too, the final slide is what will happen in November. Will we see a nation that really understands that the future is about a greener, cleaner, more efficient, more socially friendly future, or will it not? And over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an amazing intellectual breakthrough with regard to a recognition that you can grow your economy and address environmental problems. And indeed, addressing environmental problems will actually help you grow your economy. Google sits at the heart of this debate, and better than almost any country and any company on the planet has the ability to articulate what this is all about. And that's why we really love having the partnership with you. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, all of you. Now you can rebut.
Of this. I mean, it's obviously embedded in all of these. I think it's difficult to tell anyone in the world you can't have babies. You know, that's kind of a human right in a way, I think it is, but it's also a huge problem. So, you know, I just wonder what WRI's, in your opinion, is about that.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you're right. It is totally a human right. The sort of median expectations now are that population will rise to 9.6 billion by 2050. And when I said food intake will have to increase by 70%, it's partly that. It's partly also that another 3 billion will enter the middle class. And when you enter the middle class, you change your eating habits. You eat a lot more meat and so on. And so, yes, it is. But I mean, our view would be that educate women, girls and women, and that is the most effective way, together with ensuring adequate services are provided. I think the world has lost the way a little bit on population over the last 15 years. And one of the reasons for that is that many of the countries that were very much part of the debate now have problems of too little population growth. And so there's a number of rich countries now that are deeply troubled by declining populations. And if there's one thing more difficult, if you're an economic manager of a country, one thing more difficult than very rapidly rising population, it's declining population. It just does not work because you get dependency ratios of too many old people and so on. And so it's a real problem. So I totally agree. This is a big issue. We don't have, because there are other groups that sort of work on this, we don't have specifically a program. But in our major flagship document this year, which was on the future of food, we had a whole chapter on why population growth matters.
I think this probably fits into building cities around people, not cars, but I'm curious if you can share some stories around transportation and maybe some light at the end of the tunnel of what that's looking at, any projects that are happening that'll help transform some of that disaster.
Yes. We have quite a large transportation program in about 40 cities in the emerging world. There have been some revolutions that don't sound very exciting, but actually are. For example, bus rapid transit, which is when you take up part of the road and you protect it for buses in places like Mexico City, even Shanghai now, Bangalore, places like that. You're actually seeing amazing impacts. Now 200 cities have that. And what we show is that it costs about 1/10 what an underground metro would cost, but has 90% of the benefits in terms of time saved. And what we've seen in Mexico City, for example, where poor people living on the periphery took 3 hours to get to work in the morning, 3 hours to get home. So they had to leave at, like 5 o'clock in the morning, didn't get home till 9 o'clock at night, never saw their children, couldn't help them with their homework. I mean, really sort of tragic. And we've now seen that cut by almost an hour, just introducing some modern techniques. But at the end of the day, these are political choices as to whether or not leaders have the courage to say, I'm going to put money into public transportation that benefits all the citizens, or am I going to put it in roads that benefit, in developing countries, benefit the top 10%. So you've got this real tragedy in many countries where you see people sitting in air-conditioned cars, going down the street, although now they're being stuck in traffic, whilst poor people are having to change buses 4 times, and the buses just get stuck just the same way, so they take even longer. A very interesting question will be, and it's hotly debated among environmentalists, is self-driving cars, which obviously Google is the leader in. And the question is from sustainability standpoint, good or bad? It's good, clearly, in that the cars will move more smoothly, more efficiently, and obviously in a much less polluting sort of way, less stopping and starting, and of course they'll all be electric in time. But some are saying, well, is it going to sort of get in the way of public transportation? I don't think it needs to at all, actually. I mean, I think there still be a way of combining the two. But there does need to be the kind of bold action that cities like London took, where, for example, I grew up in London. I used to drive into London all the time, all right into the central London. That's how I used to get there. And about 15 years ago, 15 years ago, the government said, we're going to charge to go into the middle of London. We're going to charge electronically. So as you pass through this, you get £8 taken off your credit card. Interestingly, that's not very much money. It's not the money that changes us, but because of that psychological shift. I just lived 3 years in the suburb of London. Never once in that 3 years did I drive into London. And I will die before I ever drive into London again. I will never, ever drive a car in the center of London. How could that happen? How could that switch happen? And that's what needs to happen. And Beijing now has asked us to help them think through a similar system for Beijing. And there's a lot of complicated issues of technology and, more important, political acceptability, of course. So we're sort of simply doing the technical work with them, taking them to places like Stockholm and Singapore and London and showing them how to do that. I understand that Mayor Bloomberg in New York, who obviously was a wonderful mayor, this was the one, I think, sort of regret that he tried to move forward on congestion pricing, as it's called, and couldn't get the political support for it, because it is difficult.
Hi. On the food loss and waste, besides the agricultural remote sensing, what other opportunities do you see for applications of technology, and what are some things that us sitting in this room can be doing? Wow.
Good question, actually. I haven't thought about that. I'd have to. I think for rich countries, Tesco just came out with its annual statement and said, we want to come clean. 55,000 tons of food in our care was wasted. That's not when you take it home, you don't eat it, or your kids throw it away. It's within the care of of Tesco. And they said, we want to be transparent, and every year we're going. So the question is, what do they do? I mean, they need, which they're doing, and so is Walmart, they need very sophisticated logistical, just-in-time inventories and so on. I mean, there's just lots of tricks that they do. So to the extent that, that requires the kind of high-tech, sophisticated support that a company like Google could provide, that's one. With regard to developing countries, I think that, the issue there is for 20, 30 years, we've all known that it's a terrible, terrible waste to see these poor farmers slaving and getting yields which are not very high, and then half of the food sometimes is lost simply because they don't have storage. There are new technologies now that enable that to be kept. And of course, the existence of distributed power enables for certain crops power to be used just to keep the temperature a little bit cooler, which can dramatically affect the sustainability of the food for another month or so. Do you know what I mean? And then obviously the more sophisticated crops is all about cold storage, and there again that comes into it. But the prediction, remote sensing is potentially exceedingly important if you can see what a crop is going to be by remote sensing before the crop is harvested. If 2 months before the crop is harvested, it's going to be a bumper crop, that has all kinds of implications of how you're going to store your food and how you're going to get it to market, and enables you to get a start. Do you know what I mean? To get us a start on things. So there are some exciting possibilities, I think.
Hi, thanks for speaking today. I think that major players in sustainability are continually seeing issues like social justice and public health as really being central to environmental sustainability, whereas that's been a little bit more segmented in the past. And I wanted to know where you think are key points of overlap that are going to be really important, not just for environmental sustainability, but issues of public health, where we can sort of kill two birds with one stone.
Well, I think, if there's one truth about sort of environmental damage, is that in almost all situations, air pollution may be an exception, it hurts the poor more than the rich. In most environmental problems, the rich are able, one way or the other, to sort of buy their way out of it. So most cities, if you look at them, historically, the poor people live downwind and downriver often. So, in London, say, my city, but it's true of all cities, East End of London, always the poor area. West End of London, rich people. Why? Because West End of London, air's cleaner, water's cleaner, and so on. Do you know what I mean? I'll pollute you down. So there's a general truth that if you address environmental issues smartly, you will benefit the poor and you will advance the cause of social justice. And climate change is clearly, the case in point, the most dramatic case. There are many studies now that show the impacts of climate change on the poor will be really desperate. That's why one of the things that we do is we run a network of 300 organizations in 50 countries dedicated to giving citizens the right to have environmental data. It's called the Access Initiative. And we publish something, we've just started to publish it, we're going to do it every year, what we call an Environmental Democracy Index. And what that does, it says, look, we think that everybody has the right to know, at least, and to engage in decisions. So, for example, does a country have user-friendly data on air pollution in the capital city? But China now is a leader in that. They're not necessarily, they certainly weren't 10 years ago, but our staff in China wake up every morning, they check on their smartphone what the air pollution is, and they decide whether to put a mask on to go to work, so to speak. So environmental democracy means that all citizens have the right to get information and the right to engage in decision making. So I think the links are incredibly close.
I know you have a question, but if you don't mind, I'd like to ask one. There's a story that is in the news about the extinction crisis. Is this working? Now it is. That there's an accelerating loss of plant and animal species, hundreds, if not thousands of species going extinct, accelerating rate. And it seems to be due to climate change and habitat loss. I think something like 90% of endangered species are dependent on forests. And so as forests are cut down, we are eliminating these species. E.O. Wilson is apparently coming out with something called 50% of nature. He's like a leading biologist, ecologist at Harvard. That the idea is we can't save all of nature, but can we agree to save 50% of nature and agree on where that is and draw the line? And Eric Dinerstein of WRI, I believe, is involved with this. This book is going to come out this year. Anyway, so what is WRI's position on all that?
That's a brilliant question. One of the real puzzles is why is biodiversity and species loss not a big political issue? I mean, it's really interesting. I was at the original Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and there we saw two treaties being signed: climate change and biodiversity. In the next 5 years, biodiversity was a much hotter issue than climate change. I mean, it was really a buzzy, important issue. And in the last 15 years, it's totally fallen off the agenda, which is really interesting. Whilst climate change actually has done rather well, and even the stories I tell, you notice there about that. So I don't know whether E.O. Wilson's 50% is the right or not, but we absolutely need to demonstrate how the kinds of things we're talking about will affect biodiversity. I mean, our view is, quite frankly, that we are hoping, and we're working with IUCN in the lead up to the big IUCN conference in Hawaii later on this year, which they have every 3 years. We're hoping to get some more political buzz around biodiversity. But in the meantime, quite frankly, the policies of smart cities, cutting food waste, addressing knowledge on forests, addressing supply chains on palm oil and soy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those are the ways, practical ways, even though you don't say that's why we're doing them.
Right.
But it would be great. And Eric Dinerstein is just this wonderful fellow, and we're using Global Forest Watch now for tiger protection. I mean, it's fabulous.
Yeah.
It's a
All right,
great question.
I think you have time for one more question. You've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So I like eating meat, I enjoy it. But I think I'm lucky enough to be in a position where if I didn't have to eat meat or meat were restricted, I would be fine not eating meat and being vegetarian. You mentioned food waste and the sort of ecological impact, but I'm wondering whether the reduction of meat consumption is something that comes up in these conversations. I mean, we know it contributes to global warming in a huge way, especially in affluent nations where people don't have to eat meat. Is that something that's being talked about? Is that a part of the conversation at all?
Yeah, so it's a really important part of the conversation, and it's a really good question. Why do humans change their behavior? Why do they sometimes not change for a long time and then suddenly they will switch? And there is a very important field of psychology and commercial psychology that has learned a lot. And so what we're doing is setting up a small lab precisely to look at the issue of what it would take to get people to eat less meat. And part of that is, for example, even if you can get the leading providers of food in supermarkets to position things differently. Little things like that, sort of, the whole science of nudge now. That's really what it's about. How do you not sort of preach at them? I mean, interestingly, smoking, the reason there's been this massive shift in smoking, turns out actually is not only, or not mainly, because governments passed rules, actually. It's much more to do with social pressure, and it's to do with nudging. It's labeling, it's all things like that. So we believe this is very, very important.
Well, I think we could probably go on for another hour. You are such a font of information. Please join me in thanking Dr. Stier.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you.